Hi students, we are continuing our course Biology 102 online, and today the discussion will be about the reproductive system. Let's begin with the male reproductive system. It comes first in your textbook. It's actually not so complicated. The female reproductive system is more complicated, but let's just say a few words about the male reproductive system. Uh, First of all, the cells in in the male, which are sexual cells or gametes, they're called sperm, or sperm cells, or sperm. They are produced in the testis. Testis singular, testes plural. Note that the sperm cells are produced in males for almost the entire life of an individual. The spermatogenesis, or the production of sperm cells by meiosis, begins in prepuberty when a child is like 8, 9, 10 years old, not yet ready, of course, for reproduction, and it does not stop until a man is in his late 70s or 80s. And so the testis actually manufactures a tremendous army of sperm cells. Then if you look at the testis and see there is like a tube going straight up from the testis. Then it makes a turn. On your picture it's turned to the right, and then another turn again to the right. This pretty long tube is called the ductus deferens, or in Latin vas deferens. That's the like a highway for sperm cells to travel and to reach the seminal vesicles. If you look at the signatures on the right side of the picture, you see seminal vesicle, and the arrow points to some kind of brownish hollow vesicle, which is the seminal vesicle, or seminal vesicle. I'm not sure how to pronounce seminal, I think. In this seminal vesicle move a large number of sperm cells reach this destination, and there they are diluted or suspended in liquid, which is produced by the vesicle itself, the cells of the wall of the vesicle, and also the prostate gland. If you look to the left and down from the seminal vesicle, there is a pretty large gland which is called prostate. You have heard about prostate, right? It is in the lecture about the urinary system. We mentioned prostate. It's a gland that produces some hormones, and it is also a gland that produces a fluid which suspends the sperm cells in the seminal vesicle. Then from the seminal vesicle, you see there is a rather short tube going down and to the left and reaching urethra. This tube is called ejaculatory duct, right? And it is very narrow. By default, it actually is closed. There's like some door there. But during the arousal, at some point of arousal, this duct becomes wider, and the semen, or the fluid from the seminal vesicle, which contains sperm cells, moves to the urethra and down the urethra, away from the body. So the semen can reach the urethra via the ejaculatory duct and enter the female body during ejaculation. That's actually the point of the reason for existence of the male reproductive system. Some details of spermatogenesis. I really don't insist that you learn all these stages of the development of sperm, like primary, secondary, spermatocytes, spermatids, etc. But what you need to really know, a few things. All sperm are produced in the testes. They are produced by meiosis. It's a special kind of cell division. Recall from biology 1 that it is actually two divisions, right, following each other, and during the meiosis, pairs of homologous chromosomes part company and are packed into separate gametes or sexual cells or reproductive cells. The process of making sperm, we already mentioned that, begins in pre-puberty and continues for decades. So the semen of an adult male contains a very large number of sperm cells, tens of millions per milliliter. It does not mean that all these tens of millions are really ready for fusing with the egg. Some of them may not be viable. In all males, there's a certain percent of sperm that for some reason did not make it to a viable cell. Other are viable but not motile. The sperm has to move to swim. There's a pretty long distance for the sperm to swim to reach this egg cell. But still, in the norm, in healthy, reproductively healthy males, most sperm are viable and motile. This is an enlarged picture of a sperm. See, it has a head, a neck, a middle piece which is packed with mitochondria. Look at this. Why is that? Why so many mitochondria? Because, again, the sperm needs to move. It needs to swim. It swims by rotating its tail, kind of like a propeller in propelled aircraft. Right, and note that at the very tip of the head there is something that is called acrosome. It is a sharp end, or sharp piece that extends from the head. It is used by the sperm cells to penetrate into the egg cell, to pierce the membrane of the egg cell. And here you see that there are these myriads, armies of sperm cells that are eager to reach this one egg cell of the female, which is a lot larger than each of the sperm cells. But only one successful sperm can normally enter the egg cell. You see this moment of contact between a sperm cell and the membrane of the egg. See that there's something like an explosion, right? At the moment when the sperm touches down on the surface of the egg cell. Well, of course, it's not an explosion, but it is the start of a very quick process which leads to hardening of the membrane of the sperm cell. So normally, that's it. Other guys are not able to penetrate through this thick, hardened membrane of the egg cell. Now, there are other cells in the testis. Look at these signatures near the picture. Two arrows point to something that is called Sertoli cells. Note that there is an impression that these arrows point at empty space, but this is not so. These cells that are called Sertoli cells, they are large, and only their nuclei are visible through the microscope. The plasma membrane is lost. It is very thin and not contrasting. So you see the nuclei of the Sertoli cells. what these Sertoli cells are, they are a kind of nursing cells. They help spermatogenesis to occur during all these stages, progression from first order spermato something to spermatid to mature sperm. There must be a contact between Sertoli cells and these developing sperm cells. What exactly happens during this contact? Well, diffusion of nutrients, etc. Again, sperm are cells that need a lot of energy. They graduate into cells that move actively. See, at the top of this picture, there are mature cells that are spermatozoa that are ready to attack and penetrate the female reproductive cell. Also, you see at the bottom of this picture, there are 2 points pointing at cells that are called Leydig cells. Those are the cells that produce a male sexual hormone, testosterone. Testosterone is a lipid by chemistry. It's a steroid hormone, so it cannot have its receptor. Remember, lipid-soluble hormones have no surface receptor. They act inside the cell, inside the nucleus, targeting certain genes in the DNA. There's an interesting regulation here. The Sertoli cells, their activity is under the control of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces two hormones. Later we will talk about them. One is called the follicle stimulating hormone. It is especially active in females, and it is a principal hormone that makes ovarian follicles grow and produce estrogen. But in the male, FSH, this follicle stimulating hormone, actually stimulates Leydig cells to produce testosterone. So testosterone is a steroid. Estrogen is also a steroid. These two hormones are under the control of the same pituitary hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, but because the target cells are so different, the effect of the hormonal regulation is very different. In males, it is growth of ovarian follicles and production of estrogen, and in females, it's the growth of Leydig cells and production of testosterone. By the way, testosterone, you can imagine what testosterone does, right? It's a hormone that is responsible for secondary sexual traits in males. So it is responsible for low voice, facial hair, muscles growing most, and generally tissue growing mostly on the upper torso and limbs, fat depositing around the waist and the abdominal area, not as much in the hips and buttocks like in females. In women, any woman has some testosterone actually, and female, classical female reproductive hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and another so-called luteinizing hormone, actually they do not participate in the arousal. The arousal in both males and females depends on the level of testosterone. It's kind of weird, but that's been pretty well researched. Then in order for the sperm cells to reach the egg cell in the female body, erection must occur, right? The penis must change its shape and rigidity and size. in the penis there is the so-called erectile tissue. These in the middle of the section of the penis, you see these two large ovals merging or linked on top. They are called the erectile tissue or corpora cavernosa. It's a plural. Singular is corpus cavernosus, cavernous body. So those are two structures that have like caverns, holes in them, and these holes are filled with blood vessels. Corpora cavernosa are extremely well vascularized. They have a lot of small blood vessels, small arteries, and small veins. When male is not aroused, these blood vessels are narrow, and not much blood flows through the penis. But during the arousal, these blood vessels dilate. They become wide open and allow much blood to flow through the penis. By the way, what is responsible for that? Well, arousal, right? But more specifically, what substance acts on these blood vessels, making them wider and providing, or actually being responsible for erection? A very simple chemical called nitric oxide, NO, formula NO, there's two atoms. And the nitric oxide is produced by some nerve cells, neurons, in the tissue of the penis. And you might be interested in what are all these medications that are helping people with erectile disorders like Viagra, Cialis, etc. They act on these nerve cells in the tissue of the penis and stimulate the release of nitric oxide. When there is enough nitric oxide, the blood vessels in corpora cavernosa dilate. See, there are conditions when they are narrow even during the arousal. For example, in diabetics, in people with severe atherosclerosis, and also in aging males. It's kind of natural phenomenon, but these stimulators of nitric oxide release, they can kind of force these blood vessels to open, and this helps with erection. In women, there is also some erectile tissue. It is located in the clitoris. Next, a bit about male contraception. Well, definitely everyone heard about male condoms, right? They are a very common method of contraception, but studies show that they are efficient in maybe some 80, less than 90% of all cases. The so-called rhythm method of contraception in males, even less efficient. The most efficient way of preventing birth, birth control in males is vasectomy. What is vasectomy? See, it's shown in this picture. This vas deferens can be reached by slight incision, and during vasectomy, a part of vas deferens is simply cut out with the help of scissors, and then the ends are sewn together. Interesting, even this method of contraception does not guarantee 100% success. 90 something, 97, 98, but there you can still, a man can father children after vasectomy. It's very rare, but it may happen. Maybe because these ligatures, these threads that are used to tie the ends of the vas deferens are weakening with time or something, but it's not 100% successful, but still the most successful method of male contraception. Then I mentioned already the viability of sperm. So the sperm cells may not be viable. By simple microscopy, you cannot tell which sperm is viable and which is not. And for the diagnosis of male infertility, it is really important to establish what percentage of sperm are viable. And it is done with the help of fluorescent microscopy. It's a microscopy which is performed with the help of shining dyes, substances that stain cells, give them a certain color, and also shine in the dark, like skies in the night stars in the night sky. And there are two dyes. You don't have to know their names. I'll just mention. I worked with fluorescent microscopy, not on sperm cells, on other blood cells, but I just happen to remember FITC, fluoroisothianide cyanide, something like this. It's the green dye. And phycoerythrin, it's the orange dye. So FITC, the green dye, stains only viable sperm. And PE, phycoerythrin, the orange dye, stains only dead cells, dead sperm. So you see in this picture, well, it's hard to reach conclusion just looking at so few cells, but it looks like a sizable fraction of sperm cells in this individual are dead. So that may actually explain the male infertility. Prostate gland, we talked about the prostate gland in the lecture about the urinary system. Let's just recall again what we know about this gland. It's a very important gland. It is a gland that produces hormones called prostaglandins, which are pro-inflammatory, opposite to corticoid hormones of the adrenal gland, which inhibit inflammation and inhibit the immune system. These guys are stimulating inflammation. And also prostate produces fluid that suspends sperm cells. Remember, in this seminal vesicles, there is a fluid produced by the cells of the wall of the vesicle, but there's also fluid which is produced by the prostate gland. This fluid also fills the seminal or seminiferous vesicles. And it's interesting that this fluid is alkalic. Its pH is about 9. You might remember that they're called that neutral pH is 7. Everything that is higher than 7 is alkalic. And in the prostate secretions, the pH is 9. So why is that? It creates a certain protection for sperm cells, because when the male ejaculate or semen enters the vagina has an acidic reaction normally, and sperm are very sensible to acidity. They may all die if they're not protected with these alkalic secretions of the prostate. And as you remember, we also went over it in the lecture about the urinary system. Prostate may enlarge. It is rather common in males over 50. The enlarged prostate strangles the upper portion of the urethra and interferes with urination, and it is also a risk factor of cancer. Now let's move to more complicated matters, the anatomy and also physiology of the female reproductive system. Now see here, this is a section of the female reproductive, of the female body, and it shows you all the organs of the female reproductive system. They're called genitalia, and there are external genitalia, which include mons pubis. It's the actually the skin and connective tissue that covers the pubic bone, right? And then labia majora and labia minora Bartholin glands, special glands that uh, are they are actually well they work during arousal. They make the vagina wet, and the clitoris. Well, together, all these parts of the female reproductive system are called the vulva. The vulva is not an organ. It is the collection of all these organs. And then there are the internal genitalia, the vagina, the uterus with its cervix. See, there's uh, on the left there is an arrow pointing to the uterus, and the cervix is the part of the uterus which contacts with the vagina. Fallopian tubes, you don't see them here very well. Actually, on top of the uterus, you see a pink-colored uh, uh, part which has a hollow space in it, and there is ovary inside this hollow space. So the fallopian tubes are something that connects the ovary with the uterus, right? Uh, it uh, it's a pretty long tube filled with fluid, and it kind of provides the pathway of the egg cell from the ovary into the uterus. Now, the female reproductive cells are called eggs or ova or sometimes oocytes. Next slides we'll talk about oocytes, but it's the same thing. They are produced in the ovaries only, not in the uterus, not in the vagina. I read exams from students who don't know that ovaries are the site of production of eggs. And the production of eggs or ova or oocytes is by meiosis, right? Again, special kind of cell reproduction, two divisions, and reduction of the number of chromosomes by half, and separation of members of the pair homologous chromosomes. Uh, what is remarkable about the female reproductive system? Please remember, know this because this is practically important. Uh, the meiosis in males, remember, it occurs almost throughout life. The meiosis in females takes place before the little baby girl is born, during the fetal development, actually in the fetal ovaries. Right? So when the baby girl is born, she has as many egg cells as she will always have. And one practical implication from this is your egg cell is as old as you are, right? And uh, nowadays there is this trend to postpone birth because there are so many things to do. Women may be married for 10, 11, 12 years, and both spouses are in good health and reproductively healthy, but they just don't want children because they work and this and this and that. And when a woman is 40, 45, you know, mutations accumulate, these changes in the DNA, which may be quite harmful, they accumulate, and there is statistics that in a woman who is 18 years old, the chance to have a child with Down syndrome is about 1 in 800. In a woman who is 40 years old, this chance is 1 in 12. It still doesn't matter that if you are 40, you will always have children with birth defects, but the chance increases, the probability increases. That's statistics. Right? So it's not very wise to, and it's not that I'm saying that every 18 year young woman should immediately have children. No, but to postpone childbirth to a woman's 40s, it's not a very good, not a very healthy idea. Okay, now what occurs where in the female reproductive system? See, this shows you a frontal section of a woman's body, shows you the vagina, the uterus, and immediately look at this purple colored arrow. It says fetus develops here. Fetus develops in the uterus. Note that uterus has walls. These walls are pretty thick. They consist mostly of muscle cells, and these muscle cells do a very intense job of contracting during the childbirth. Now, there is an arrow pointing from the left to the uh, inner layer of the uterus. It's called endometrium. It's a thin, normally, or in a woman that is, unless this woman is in the late part of her menstrual cycle, the endometrium is very thin. It's just a layer or a few layers of cells. And it is very important. Endometrium is extremely important for development of the embryo. You will see later how it works in implantation and securing the place of the embryo in the uterus. Then you see fallopian tubes, right? It says fallopian tube or oviduct. And I added to this, you see, on the right upper right corner, I wrote, fertilization, fusion of an egg with a sperm, occurs here, right? So imagine the road of a little sperm cell from the site where it enters the woman's body to the site where it will maybe fertilize the egg cell. It's pretty long, right? So it tells you a lot about normal physiology of sperm cells. They are extremely hard-working cells. They must rotate their tails and swim and swim and swim and reach the fallopian tube. One kind of side note that you probably know that when a male is drunk, this increases the probability of birth defects. Again, it's a statistics, right? So you all know this kind of slogan, don't drink and drive, right? And for sperm cells, or for the owner of the sperm cells, this slogan can be rephrased, don't drink and swim. That's really being inebriated, intoxicated during the sexual act, it does increase the probability of a number of birth defects. Okay, then you see this fallopian tube kind of embracing the ovary. There are two fallopian tubes and there are two ovaries. Now, if the fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube, the development of egg cells, or their maturation, their becoming ready for fertilization, occurs in the ovary, in the ovary. So in the fetal ovary, when the girl is not yet born, there is meiosis, and diploid cells of the fetal ovary undergo meiosis, become haploid egg cells. And then in the girl who begins to menstruate, the menstrual cycle begins. And during this menstrual, well, what's the purpose of the menstrual cycle actually? It is to prepare the eggs, make them ready for fertilization, and also make uterus ready for implantation. So that's kind of what happens where in the uh, reproductive system. Then this is a pretty difficult slide, but bear with me. This must be understood. I'm really not happy when I find out that my students who are adult women, sometimes married, sometimes with children, they have no idea about their menstrual cycle, what happens when. That's not good. It's not good. Women absolutely must know what happens during menstrual cycle, and men too. Men should really have some knowledge about the preparation of the egg for fertilization. So this picture shows you an ovary, right? And it says, beginning from puberty, a woman's egg cells or ova or oocytes become part of a monthly cycle of preparation for fertilization. Uh, there is a common belief that every month a woman produces an egg. It's not quite so. Again, egg cells are already produced. They have been produced during fetal development before birth. But each month, a certain number of eggs, it may be one, it may be two, it may be eight, it may be 12, a certain number of eggs are getting ready for fertilization. So what happens? This picture, see, shows you some red circles. These red circles are what we call ovarian follicles. Please don't mix them up with hair follicles, because again, I've heard or read students' statements on the exam that ovaries have hair. No. Ovaries have ovarian follicles. Follicles are structures that contain egg cells or oocytes, surrounded by non-sexual or diploid cells. So each egg cell in a woman is kind of imprisoned. It's surrounded by a thick wall of cells. It cannot escape from there. Now, these cells that form this wall, they are hormone producing. And they can produce two kinds of hormones, but on this slide, let's just concentrate on uh, one of them, uh, beginning from the first day of the cycle. See, the first day of the cycle, in the picture, it is marked by figure 1, and it is the follicles during the first, second, third, etc. days of the menstrual cycle. They are shown uh, in the upper left corner. They are rather small, but you see them growing, right? So beginning from the first day of the cycle, follicles grow, enlarge, and note, how do they enlarge? Only these cells that are forming the wall are dividing. Egg cells do not divide. They are final stop. They are too differentiated to divide. But the cells of the wall divide, and so the follicle grows inside and produces a female hormone, estrogen, the steroid hormone, lipid-soluble hormone, which is responsible for female reproductive, female sexual traits like high-pitched voice, female figure, female type of fat distribution, lack of facial hair, etc., etc. So this is what makes women look like women. And then see, look at uh, figures or figures that are marked with numbers 3 and 4. At some point, the follicle becomes so big, and the estrogen, one of the hormones of the pituitary gland stimulate this growth of follicles, but also estrogen, which is produced by cells of the follicle, also stimulate the growth of the cells of the follicle. So it's like a cell makes something, and this something tells her divide. So at some point there is so much estrogen, and the follicle becomes so big that it bursts. It ruptures, and you see in the upper left corner of this figure there is something like a missile launched from the disrupted burst follicle, and this rocket is a little egg cell, or secondary oocyte. It means the oocyte which is ready to be fertilized. Where does it go? See, it doesn't return to the ovary. It goes into the fallopian tube. And there in the fallopian tube, it waits to meet with sperm cells to be fertilized, which, again, may or may not happen. Then the uh, next part, what is shown at the bottom of this slide, we will discuss in the next slide. Uh, this picture shows how the female reproductive cycle or menstrual cycle is regulated by hormones. At the top of this figure, you see the pituitary gland, right, which is, of course, if you remember from lectures about the endocrine system, it is under the control of hypothalamus. It produces two hormones. It produces more than two hormones, but for this discussion, two hormones are, they need to be mentioned. See the abbreviations FSH and LH. What are they? Uh, First, let's agree on numbers. Day one of the cycle, menstrual cycle, what is it? By convention, it is the day when the menstrual discharge appears. First drops of blood, first little pieces of discharge. That's the when you see that, that's the first day of the menstrual cycle. So during these first several days of the cycle, between day 1 and day 12 to 15, what do you see? You see an arrow in the pituitary gland going from FSH, right, to ovarian follicles. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, stimulates the growth of the follicle and the production of estrogen. Both of these things. Then, if you look, going from left to right. Immediately to the right from this, from the growing follicle, you see disrupting follicle. Right? It happens in the middle of the cycle, between 12 and 15. In different women, it varies a little bit, but in any case, it is the middle of the menstrual cycle. The ovarian follicle disrupts, bursts, and releases the egg cell, which goes into the fallopian tube. Now, this disrupted follicle kind of continues to produce estrogen, but less and less of estrogen, and it now dramatically changes. If you look to the right from this disrupting follicle, you'll see three little circles that are painted yellow. They're called yellow body or corpus luteum in Latin. And if you go back to the anterior pituitary, you see an abbreviation LH and an arrow going from this LH to corpus luteum. What is that? LH stands for luteinizing hormone. Right? So the disruption of the follicle in the middle of the menstrual cycle is called ovulation. And the fate of the disrupted follicle, which remains after the ovulation, is to become this corpus luteum or yellow body. And this process is under the control of the luteinizing hormone. Note that the anterior pituitary works like a clock in a way. Between day 1 and say day 15, it produces follicle stimulating hormone, which tells the follicles to grow and produce estrogen. Right? from the moment of ovulation, it switches to a different job. It produces luteinizing hormone, which tells the disrupted follicles to turn into yellow bodies. Now, what are these yellow bodies? Why do we need them? Well, women need them. Men also need them if they want to be fathers. You know, everyone needs them. They are endocrine glands, actually, which produce a hormone called progesterone. Look in this rectangle under the yellow bodies. It says progesterone and estrogens. Why estrogens in plural? Actually, there are three chemical specimens of the mixture, which we call estrogen, but usually estrogen is used in singular. So progesterone. What is this progesterone? Look, in the first half of the menstrual cycle, from day one to ovulation, we didn't talk about progesterone. There is almost no progesterone in the woman's body. But from day 14, 15, 16, 17, there's more and more progesterone. What happens? Progesterone acts on the endometrium, on this inner layer of cells in the uterus, inner lining of the uterus. Together with estrogen, progesterone stimulates the growth of endometrium. So it makes cells of the endometrium divide. And during the first day of menstrual cycle, it could be just a few layers of cells. On day 23, 24, 25, 26, it's hundreds of layers of cells, right? Just mitosis has occurred. And also, look what happens. Blood vessels grow. There is more and more blood vessels in the endometrium. Endometrium is a kind of epithelium. If you take a histology course, they will tell you in detail about properties of epithelial tissue. Normally, this tissue has no blood vessels, but as progesterone increases, it stimulates this vascularization of the endometrium, the growth of blood vessels into the thickness of endometrium. Why is this important? Because remember, this little egg cell which travels from the ovary, from the disrupted ovarian follicle, disrupted during ovulation, travels into the fallopian tube, and then via the fallopian tube, it goes into the uterus, into the cavity of the uterus. If it is fertilized, if it's not fertilized, then, well, it will kind of hang around in the cavity of the uterus and kind of die by natural death within, like, I don't know, 24, 48 hours, 1 to 2 days. But if it is fertilized, to survive, it needs to implant. It needs to stick to the wall, to the inner lining of the uterus, to the endometrium. If the endometrium is not vascularized, if there are no blood vessels in it, implantation, in sticking of the fertilized egg to the wall of the endometrium may not occur, right? So the pregnancy will not begin. So, you know, there is a saying that life begins with conception, and this is sort of the veracity of this claim depends more on your faith, religious maybe faith, than on experimental findings, because we don't really know what life is. Some claim that if the fertilized egg just divides a few times, it's still not life. But what, from the point of view of like strict dry biology, what we can say is that life definitely is begins to be supported after implantation. Whether you believe or not that it begins with the conception, but it begins to be supported by the organism from the moment of implantation, because before the implantation, the division of this fertilized egg will not really result in anything. It will still die by natural death in several days. It will not develop into an embryo and fetus. Implantation is absolutely needed. Right? So, after, again, to summarize, after the ovulation, FSH stops, LH is produced, LH stimulates the growth of yellow bodies. Yellow bodies stimulate the production of progesterone by these yellow bodies, and progesterone uh, uh, prepares the uterus for implantation. If the fertilization did not occur, naturally fertilization will not occur either, and but progesterone is still there, so it will continue to act until the endometrium grows so big and so filled with these little blood vessels that it breaks. There are multiple points of hemorrhage in the endometrium, and it begins to bleed and peel. Right? And when it peels and bleeds, then we can return back to the first day of the menstrual cycle. So the cycle repeats. Right? What we call menstruation is actually this very, very end part of the previous cycle and very, very beginning part of the next cycle. It is peeling and bleeding of the endometrium, which is caused by progesterone. Uh, if the fertilization has occurred, then progesterone prepares the uterus and the implantation may become possible. Normally, after that, the production of progesterone stops. So if a woman is pregnant, usually, I stress on this, usually she stops menstruating because there is no more progesterone, right? Without progesterone, there will be no vascularization of the endometrium and no bleeding and no discharge, so there will be no more menstruations till the baby is born. But sometimes in some women, for some reason, yellow bodies survive for quite a long time and continue to produce progesterone. So these women menstruate, and it may kind of, mislead. A woman may think that she's not pregnant for month, 2, 3, right? So it's kind of tells you that it's never a bad idea if you doubt. Never a bad idea to check yourself with this home pregnancy kit, because whether you menstruate or not, this pregnancy kit will detect the presence of fetal cells, the hormone produced by fetal cells, the so-called chorionic gonadotropin, will be detected. But it is not absolutely safe to rely just on the absence or presence of menstruation. Okay, and what happens after fertilization? To understand this picture, you need to look at the top of it. It says fertilization, and then move counterclockwise. You see fertilized egg. First you see the egg cell and the sperm cells attacking it. One of them fertilizes it. Then, to the left, you see two nuclei, sperm nucleus and egg nucleus. So the two cells fused, but for maybe a day or so, their nuclei remain separate. Then their nuclei fuse, and what you see is a cell called zygote to the left and down from the first stop after fertilization. A zygote is a diploid cell, right? It is the result of the fusion between the egg and the cell. The egg is haploid, the sperm is haploid. What does it mean, haploid? Pairs of homologous chromosomes during meiosis part company, right? So if the cell that enters meiosis has 46 chromosomes, like human cells have 46 chromosomes, the end result of the meiosis, whether it's a sperm or an egg, will have 23 chromosomes. And then when zygote forms, 23 chromosomes from the egg and 23 chromosomes from the uh, sperm form the 46 chromosomes of the future baby. Then the zygote begins to divide by mitosis, to continue to move counterclockwise. You see 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, 8-cell stage, etc. And then you see something that is called morula, and morula is a little ball of dividing cells which uh, are different in shape, and there is a little bit of space between them, and this space actually increases. And you see where do you first detect this morula? In the uterus. This little ball rolling from the fallopian tube into the uterus. That's morula. Then the cells continue to divide, and morula turns into what we call blastocyte. Blastocyst. Blastocyst is, again, it's a little ball of dividing cells, but it has differentiation of cells. Cells are kind of, they divide their responsibilities. One layer of cells is the inner cell mass. The other layer is, we call it trophoblast. That's the part of the blastocyst which turns toward the endometrium and attaches to the endometrium. So you see, if you look at the cavity of the uterus, you see this blastocyst, and it says beginning of implantation. Right? Implantation is not a momentary process. It takes actually several days. So in about between 5 and 10 days, the blastocyst continues to grow by cell division and finalizes its attachment or implantation into the uterus. From that part, the embryo begins to grow. Uh, and further stages of the embryonic development is very sketchy. If you take histology and embryology, especially embryology course, you will hear very detailed lectures about all the stages of embryonic and fetal development. I'll just go very briefly. That see, the upper left corner shows you forming embryo for beginning from day 15 after fertilization. It's just a bunch of, or a little ball of dividing cells. Then it's a ball of dividing cells with some little tail sticking from it. Then it looks something like, sort of like a little flat worm. Right? Then it looks more like a tiny little fish, right? And then beginning from day 26, 30, it acquires shape which is more and more like highly different, higher vertebrates. Since at some point it looks like a reptile, amphibian, then reptile, then bird, and then finally a little mammal. You see the egg is, the head is increasing in size, and the limbs begin to form clearly. You see even fingers and toes beginning from something like 53 for day 53, 54, and then on 60 days, that's 2 months pregnancy, you see something that actually reminds you of a little baby, right? It has crossed arms, hands with fingers, crossed legs, toes. So it's and at this point, this embryo has a very well developed circulatory system, very well developed respiratory system, although the embryo, of course, does not breathe. The diaphragm does not contract. The air is not coming into the embryo's body. The first breath will take place when the baby is actually born. Right? Uh, then what forms later, what happens later? The embryo becomes fetus from approximately the beginning of the 5th month of pregnancy. You see a little fetus, which is actually, it's like a baby. It can move, and the mother feels the movement of the baby. It can push the walls of the placenta of this big sac that encloses this baby. And I saw some amazing pictures. I wish I could find them. Never found them on the internet. I probably you guys try if you find them. That's great. There are even movies made uh, uh, tracing the movements of the fetus, and it's interesting that at the beginning of the 5th month, the fetus can frown. Obviously, it moves the muscles of its forehead and shows this expression of extreme unhappiness, boredom, I don't know, anger or something. But beginning from the beginning of the 6 months, it smiles. It smiles pretty much all the time, most of the time. And it's interesting that fetuses may hear sounds. Their auditory organs, their inner ears, are still not very well developed, but they can hear some sound. They can hear music. They can hear their mothers sing and sweet talk to them, etc. So they are pretty well-developed creatures, and by the time they are ready to leave their mother's body, normally they start to breathe using the contractions of the diaphragm, and their lungs will be filled with oxygen, air, oxygen will diffuse into red blood cells, etc., etc., etc. And when the umbilical cord is severed, right, the umbilical cord attaches the body of the fetus to the placenta and to the body of the mother. But by the time the baby is born, the baby does not need the contact with the mother anymore because the baby has a developed digestive system. It has the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. It produces all these digestive enzymes, etc. So it can feed by itself. And first, of course, naturally, it is first fed by breast milk, and then gradually it begins to eat other foods and solid foods, and uh, then, no, I was going to say that this is the result. But we need to go back. Oh, I don't know how to go back to this. in this, but uh, the previous slide showed you the labor. The labor is actually the work of the muscles of the uterus. The contractions of the muscles of the uterus are stimulated by the pituitary hormone, which is called oxytocin. Oxytocin, it's interesting, it has two separate functions. One of them is to stimulate the labor, stimulate the work of the muscles of the uterus. And it also stimulates the so-called myoepithelial cells. Those are sort of muscle cells that surround the nipples. When oxytocin stimulates these cells, the milk uh, appears. The milk is expunged from the breast gland and appears on the surface of the nipple so the baby can feed. And the other function of oxytocin, it's very interesting, it's in a way, it's a hormone of pleasure. Pleasurable sensations, tactile sensations, are very much dependent on oxytocin. Sexual pleasure is very much controlled by oxytocin. So I already mentioned that testosterone is important for the uh, wholesome, healthy sexual contact. Uh, Testosterone produced in men and also to some extent in women. And then oxytocin is also very important. Uh, okay, and you don't need to really memorize all these stages of labor, etc. If you go to our nursing school, I'm sure that they will train you uh, how to recognize the stages of the childbirth, etc., and how to uh, help the delivery of the baby. But that's beyond our course. Uh, some few words about contraceptives. In women, of course, just like in men, there is mechanical contraception, condoms. Women may use mechanical contraception, diaphragms, etc., but it's not very reliable. Our oral contraception devices or oral contraceptives are thought to be better, more reliable. Uh, what are these pills that prevent childbirth? They are actually hormonal preparations. They, their goal is to prevent ovulation. So please, if someone tells you that contraceptive pills kill babies, tell this person that when a woman takes contraceptives, they prevent ovulation. So the baby simply cannot exist if the ovulation does not occur. What kind of baby can be produced? Contraceptives have nothing to do with killing the embryo or fetus, etc. Contraceptives prevent ovulation. They are a mixture of female hormones, progesterone and estrogen. Uh, if you recall, progesterone is under the control of the luteinizing hormone. Uh, Follicle stimulating hormone controls the production of estrogen. Now, if a woman takes a pill which is a concentrated, large dose preparation of both estrogen and progesterone, the pituitary gland becomes kind of confused. It senses the presence of large amounts of these hormones. So it sort of uh, remains confused, and just to be on the safe side, it stops producing FSH and LH altogether. And the estrogen and the progesterone, which are in the pill, they degrade in 24, 48 hours. But the uh, pituitary gland still does not produce FSH, still does not produce LH, so there's no ovulation, right? There's no ovulation. Uh, Oral contraceptives, again, they are not 100% guarantee against pregnancy. I don't remember the exact statistics, but something like between maybe 5 and 10% of cases, there are women do conceive even taking contraceptive pills, but still they are so far rather uh, efficient contraceptive device. Again, I repeat, not killing the baby. It's not something that provokes abortions or something. No, it prevents the ovulation. And just to finish, these days there is so much talk about the in vitro fertilization. Again, some women cannot conceive. There is a laundry list of reasons why a woman cannot conceive, and it includes lack of pituitary function, lack of estrogen, lack of progesterone, lack of both progesterone and estrogen, etc., etc., etc. Or it may be other reasons, maybe something wrong with the endometrium, the response of endometrium to progesterone, whatever. So in this case, women uh, donate their eggs. uh, the eggs can be fertilized in vitro in a test tube, literally. The procedure is very well developed, and it's quite real, quite possible. And then the fertilized uh, um, uh, eggs are transferred, well, either in this woman, if she is capable of giving birth, was just not capable of conceiving for some reason, or in the so-called surrogate mother who will carry the baby to term and uh, return it to the biological mother. There is a lot of that's of course it's a risky thing. It's risky in both physical sense and ethical sense because you know that some surrogate mothers they agree that this baby will not be theirs, that it will be returned to the donor of the egg cells, etc., etc. But sometimes these surrogate mothers actually can be donors of the egg cells. These egg cells can be frozen and used for in vitro fertilization. And the woman who wants to have a baby will think that these eggs are just from some random donor, and in fact, they were from the so-called surrogate mother. So in this case, the surrogate mother will be actually the like half biological mother, right? Or actually, well, biological mother sperm will come from a different person anyway. There are still some ethical considerations, but I don't know. In our day and age, when couples wait, and also when there is an increase in uh, female infertility because of sexually transmitted diseases, the gonorrhea in females is at first asymptomatic. In males, it's a terrible pain, but in females, they don't notice when they contract gonorrhea, and then all of a sudden, boom, it turned out that this gonococcus established a colony in their womb, and they cannot carry the child. So there are, in any case, the number of in vitro fertilizations keeps to increase, and hardly anything can be done about it, except there must be certainly a better control of who really gives the egg and who really is the biological mother. Okay, that's pretty much it for this lecture. So to summarize, what I want you to know, guys, as far as male reproductive system, please know how sperm cells form, know how the semen forms, male ejaculate, learn the mechanism of erection, because again, I can tell you that in my previous semesters, pretty regularly, I read students write on their exams that erection means a contraction of a huge and very strong muscle in the penis. No, it's not. It's actually relaxation of smooth muscles in the walls of blood vessels in the corpora cavernosa under the influence of nitric oxide. Then about the female reproductive system, please understand the menstrual cycle. Very important. Understand that what are follicles? Why do they grow? When do they grow? When do they disrupt? What's ovulation? Know about ovulation. And remember, ovulation, the time of ovulation, is the best time to conceive a child. That's the time when little egg cells are freed from their prison, right? They just jump out of these disrupting follicles and say, fertilize me. So that's the best time to conceive. And I don't know, for some reason, again, almost every semester I got answers from female students, some of them married and some of them with children, who said that the best day to conceive a child is day one of the menstrual cycle. And, my jaw just drops to the floor because that's the worst day to conceive. It's the day when you bleed. It's the day of the beginning of menstruation, and it's the day when both estrogen and progesterone are very low. And the endometrium is not only not ready to implant, but it is peeling. So it's just, it's probably it's still, theoretically it is possible to conceive on any day of the menstrual cycle. But if you choose one least favorable day, that's day one. Okay, and also know what are the yellow bodies, know the concept of progesterone, what progesterone does, how does it prepare the uterus, and know about the implantation. That's really very serious. There are women who cannot conceive even though their menstrual cycle seems pretty regular and normal, right? But their yellow bodies just do not produce enough progesterone. And estrogen by itself cannot uh, prepare the endometrium for implantation. So these women have to, if they want to conceive, they need to implant. So they need to get external, maybe synthetic progesterone, injections or pills, or I don't know, but otherwise they will probably not conceive. Okay, thank you for listening, and this is the end of our today's lecture. See you next time. What is our next lecture? It will be on the nervous system. Okay. Best wishes.